She slid a blank check across the table and said, "Name your price. Just get through this weekend without anyone dying." He stared at it. Then at her. Daniel Garrett hadn't held a check like that since the Navy stopped signing his paychecks. Since his daughter started drawing pictures of him coming home. Since he decided a desk job was better than a body bag. But Victoria Hale wasn't asking for a desk job. She was asking him to walk into a room full of wolves dressed as a lamb. What neither of them knew, one of those wolves already knew his face. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss where this goes. The envelope hit the kitchen counter at 6:47 on a Thursday morning. Daniel Garrett was flipping pancakes with one hand and holding a juice box with the other when it landed. He hadn't heard anyone knock. He hadn't heard the door open. He had apparently forgotten to lock it again, a habit his 6-year-old daughter Lily had been reminding him about for 3 weeks straight. "Daddy," she said from the table, not even looking up from her coloring book. Someone came in. "I noticed," he said. He set down the spatula, turned around, and found Victoria Hale standing in his kitchen like she owned it, which, given the building she'd had her legal team quietly acquire 18 months ago, was closer to the truth than he was comfortable admitting. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white blouse. No jewelry, except a thin watch on her left wrist. Her dark hair was pulled back so tight, it looked like a decision, not a hairstyle. She was carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than his truck, and she was scanning his kitchen with the kind of calm, systematic precision that Daniel recognized from exactly one category of person operators. People trained to read a room and calculate threat levels before they even said hello. He didn't like that she had it. He especially didn't like how good she was at it. "Ms. Hale," he said. "Mr. Garrett." She set the envelope on the counter and slid it toward him with 2 fingers. "I need you this weekend." Lily's crayon stopped moving. Daniel picked up the envelope without opening it. It was heavier than it should have been for paper. "You could have called." "I did. 3 times. My phone was off. I know. I had someone check." She said it without apology, without any awareness that it should require one. "You were at your daughter's school reading program. Wednesday evenings, 6 to 7:30. The school librarian confirmed you haven't missed one in 14 months. He put the envelope back down. "You had someone pull my schedule. I had someone confirm you were alive and not on another contract." She glanced at Lily, then back at him. "I needed to know if you were available before I made the drive." "You drove here yourself?" "My driver is aware of the address. I prefer not to bring staff into conversations like this until I know what the answer is." Daniel looked at his daughter. Lily had gone back to coloring. She was currently filling in a picture of a horse with 4 different shades of purple, unconcerned with the CEO, standing 6 feet away from her breakfast. He turned back to the stove, saved the pancakes before they burned, and said, "How'd you find me?" "Owen Marsh." He didn't react. He'd learned a long time ago not to react to that name in front of anyone. Owen Marsh was his former commanding officer, then his contact at a private federal contracting firm, and now apparently the person handing out his home address to corporate executives. They were going to have a conversation about that. "Owen doesn't give out my information." "Owen gave out your information," she said simply. "He said you were the only person he trusted for this specific kind of problem. He also said you'd probably say no, and that I should come in person and bring the number high enough to be worth reconsidering." "What's the number?" "Open the envelope." He did. The check was hand-signed. The amount had enough zeros that he read it twice, then set it down carefully on the counter so it wasn't near the stove. "That's for a weekend," he said. "Friday evening through Sunday, possibly Monday morning depending on how the situation develops." "What's the situation?" She pulled out the leather portfolio, set it on the kitchen counter beside his coffee maker, and opened it. Inside, photographs, a printed organizational chart, a series of financial documents he'd need about 45 minutes to fully decode, and a photo of a man mid-40s, square jaw, the kind of smile that got people to sign things they shouldn't. "My sister Sophie is getting married Saturday," Victoria said. To that man. His name is Reed Calloway. Calloway, Daniel repeated. He looked at the photo. The smile was wrong, not in any obvious way, just wrong in the specific way that men who were very good at seeming trustworthy were always slightly wrong if you knew what you were looking for. What's his background? Officially, venture capital, mergers and acquisitions consulting. He has a clean record, 2 prior business partnerships that dissolved quietly, and excellent references from people who, when I had them looked into, turned out to share a single attorney. That's not clean. That's managed. I know that. My legal team knows that. My mother does not want to know that, and my sister is in love. She said those last 4 words the way someone described a natural disaster, something real. Something you couldn't argue with, something you just had to survive. The wedding is in 3 days. The ceremony is Saturday. Monday morning, Hale Corporation holds its quarterly board vote. Reed has been positioning himself through Sophie's shares through a series of proxy agreements she doesn't fully understand through a document she signed 8 months ago that she thought was a prenuptial planning form to control a significant portion of the board vote outcome. Daniel was quiet for a moment. So this isn't about the wedding. The wedding is the delivery mechanism, she said. Once they're married, his legal position inside the family trust changes. Everything he's been setting up becomes nearly impossible to unwind without destroying Sophie publicly and tearing the family apart in court for years. And you can't just tell Sophie. Sophie is my sister. Something shifted in Victoria's voice, just slightly, just enough. She has been in love with this man for 2 years. She has planned this wedding for 11 months. She has never in her entire life had anyone look at her the way she describes Reed looking at her. She paused. If I walk into her bedroom tonight and tell her the man she's marrying is using her as a legal instrument without absolute irrefutable proof in my hand, I lose her. Not temporarily. Permanently. She will never forgive me. So you need proof. I need someone who can move through that event without drawing attention. Someone who can access networks, monitor communications, and identify the exact mechanism he plans to use so that when I present it, it is not my opinion. It is not my lawyer's theory. It is fact. Documented. Airtight. She looked at him steadily. Owen said you ran counterintelligence asset protection for 3 tours before you transitioned out. He said in environments with high social complexity and active threat concealment, you were the best he'd ever worked with. Owen is generous when he wants something. Are you saying he's wrong? Daniel looked at the check, then at Lily, who had moved on from the horse and was now earnestly coloring a rainbow over its head. He thought about the school reading program. 14 months, no absences. He thought about the parent-teacher conference next Thursday, and the dentist appointment he'd rescheduled twice, and the fact that Lily had a soccer game Sunday afternoon at 11 o'clock, and he had never once missed one of those either. He thought about the mortgage on this apartment and the savings account he was building for her college, and the way she'd looked at him last month when he told her he wasn't going anywhere, that those kinds of trips were done, that he was staying right here. He picked up the check. I need to make a call, he said. And I need to know where Lily stays while I'm gone. Victoria reached into the portfolio and pulled out a second sheet of paper. I've arranged for Mrs. Patricia Hensley, your neighbor, in 4C retired schoolteacher background check to be available as needed. She's already been compensated for the weekend. She's expecting you to confirm with her this evening. He stared at her. You arranged childcare, he said flatly. I told you. Owen said you'd say no. I prepared for every variable. Did it occur to you, Daniel said slowly, that arranging childcare for a man's child without asking him might be something he takes issue with? She blinked, and for just a fraction of a second, one single beat something that might have been genuine discomfort crossed her face. I wasn't trying to overstep. I was trying to solve the problem. There's a difference between solving a problem and running over the people in front of it. Another pause, shorter this time. You're right, she said. I should have asked first. I'll have Mrs. Hensley's number sent to your phone and leave it to you to make that arrangement. It wasn't an apology, but from a woman who clearly hadn't been told no very often in the last decade, it was closer than he'd expected. "Cover story," he said. "If I'm walking into a room full of people who know the Hale family, I need to be something that makes sense. Business consultant. Retained by Hale Corporation for compliance review and executive support. It's plausible, it's documented, and it gives you reason to be anywhere in that venue without raising questions." "You built documentation already." "I built documentation 3 days ago when I first decided to approach you." He almost smiled. Almost. "One condition," he said. "Name it." "Sunday, 11 a.m. I'm gone. Whatever's happening, whatever's left, I walk out the door and I'm at a soccer field in 40 minutes. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "Agreed." He picked up the check again, looked at it, set it face down on the counter. "I'll need everything you have on Callaway," he said. "Financial history, business associations, communications. If you have them, every document Sophie signed in the last 2 years. I'll need a layout of the venue, the guest list, staff arrangements, and access to whatever security infrastructure is on site. I'll have it to you by tonight. And Ms. Hale." She paused in closing her portfolio. "Next time," he said, "knock." She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then, without expression, noted. She left. The door closed behind her with a soft, precise click. Lily looked up from her coloring book. "Daddy, who was that lady?" "Someone who needs help," he said. "Is she nice?" He thought about the blank check. The prearranged childcare. The way she'd said I should have asked first, not easily, but genuinely. "I don't know yet," he said. "Probably complicated." Lily considered this with the gravity of a 6-year-old processing important information. Like Mrs. Patterson at school. Maybe a little like that. "Mrs. Patterson is nice," Lily said seriously. "She just forgets that other people have feelings sometimes." Daniel picked up his spatula and went back to the stove. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Something like that." He spent that night at his kitchen table with 3 mugs of coffee and a printer he'd bought second-hand 18 months ago and barely used since. The files Victoria sent were thorough. More thorough than most corporate legal teams managed. Her people had pulled Callaway's full business history going back 11 years. 2 dissolved partnerships, both ending in out-of-court settlements with non-disclosure agreements. A venture fund that had raised capital from 9 investors and returned clean profits to 7 of them. The other 2 were still in arbitration, and their attorneys were, as Victoria had noted, the same man. A Denver-based lawyer named Philip Crane, who specialized in, according to his own firm's website, complex asset restructuring and estate resolution. That was a polite way to describe what Daniel was seeing in the documents. Callaway didn't steal. Stealing was obvious. Stealing left fingerprints and angry people willing to testify. What Callaway did was slower and considerably more elegant. He built relationships. He charmed families. He found women, and it was always women. Daniel noted, always women with family money and brothers or fathers who were too distant or distracted to pay close attention, and he made them feel seen in a specific, practiced, devastatingly effective way. Then he created proximity to assets through legal mechanisms that looked on paper like love. Prenuptial agreements with unusual provisions. Trust amendments framed as estate planning. Share proxies disguised as administrative simplifications. By the time anyone realized what had happened, they were already married to it. Daniel cross-referenced the shell companies listed in the documents Victoria's team had flagged. 3 of them tied back to a holding entity registered in Delaware that had been formed. He checked the date 6 weeks after Reed Callaway and Sophie Hale's first public appearance together at a charity event. 6 weeks. He'd started building the exit before he'd finished building the entrance. Daniel sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He'd dealt with enemy combatants, hostile surveillance operations, and asset extractions in 3 different conflict zones. He'd navigated political situations where the wrong word in the wrong room could start something that took years to end. But there was something uniquely cold about what Calloway did. Something that required a specific kind of person. Not someone driven by desperation or ideology or even simple greed. Someone who genuinely did not see the people around them as people. He printed the organizational chart, pinned it to the corkboard he used for active cases, drew the connections with a red marker. At the center of the web, 2 lines converged Calloway's shell company structure on one side, Sophie Hale's trust and her 17% share in Hale Corporation on the other. Between them, one document, a proxy agreement witnessed and notarized that Sophie had signed 8 months ago. The notation in the margin of Victoria's summary said she believed it was a joint investment strategy. He described it as protecting her future. Daniel capped the marker. "Yeah," he said to the empty room. "They always do." He called Owen at 7 in the morning, knowing the man had been awake since 5. "You gave her my address," Daniel said. "Morning to you too." Owen's voice was unbothered in the way of men who had long since made peace with not apologizing for things they'd do again. "You weren't returning calls. I was at Lily's reading program." "I know, I told her that." "Did she tell you I told her that?" "She told me she confirmed it with the school librarian." A pause. "Well," Owen said, "she's thorough. She arranged childcare for my daughter without asking me." "Did she fix it when you told her that was a problem?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. "She fixed it," Owen confirmed from the silence. "Listen, Garrett, I've worked with the Hale Corporation on 2 federal compliance reviews in the past 4 years. Victoria Hale is difficult, she is demanding, and she runs on about 3 hours of sleep and sheer institutional determination. She is also, in my experience, one of the few executives in that tax bracket who actually gives a genuine damn about the people who work for her. The problem she's dealing with is real. The threat to her sister is real, and the man she's up against is the kind of problem that doesn't get solved by lawyers alone. You could have called and made this case yourself." "I could have, but you would have said no to me because I'm asking you to go back to something that looks too much like what you left, and we both know it." A beat. "She's asking you to protect someone's family. That's different. You know it's different." The corkboard was still in front of him. Red lines. Sophie Hale's name at the end of one of them. "The number was significant," Daniel said. "The number is what the job is worth to her," Owen said. "That's not manipulation. That's honesty." Daniel looked at the proxy agreement printed out in front of him. The notarized signature. A woman who thought she was protecting her future. "Tell me the parts she didn't tell me," he said. Owen went quiet for a moment. Then, Margaret Hale. The mother. "You need to be prepared for something," Owen said. "I can't get into the specifics because some of it crosses into confidentiality I'm still bound by. But when you walk into that venue, Daniel, there is going to be a moment with Margaret Hale that Victoria does not fully anticipate. And how you handle it is going to matter more than anything else you do that weekend. That's not enough information to work with. I know. It's all I've got. You'll understand when it happens." Owen paused. "Just don't lock it down when it does. Don't go operational on it. Let it be what it is." Daniel didn't know what that meant, but he wrote it down anyway. Margaret Hale. Don't lock it down. "One more thing," he said. "Calloway's going to make me. I don't care how good the cover documentation is. A man who does what he does learns to read the room the same way I do. Different training, same instinct." "Probably," Owen agreed. "So what's the play when he does?" "Same as it always is," Owen said. "You let him think he's smarter. You let him move. And you make sure that when he does, everything he touches turns into evidence." After he hung up, Daniel sat quietly for a moment. Then he looked at the corkboard one more time. Calloway's photograph in the upper right corner. That smile. "All right," Daniel said quietly. "Let's see what you're really made of." He pulled out the venue layout and got to work. He confirmed with Mrs. Hensley in person that evening on his own terms with Lily present. He explained what the weekend was, as much as he could explain, and watched Lily and Patricia Hensley negotiate over which movies were acceptable viewing on a Friday night, with a seriousness that made him feel briefly like the world was not entirely broken. He packed a single bag. Navy habit. Everything essential, nothing extra. Every item with a specific function. He packed Lily's favorite stuffed rabbit in her bag because that was not a Navy habit. That was a dad habit. And that one he'd decided he was allowed to keep. Friday morning, he crouched down in the hallway and held his daughter's face in his hands for a moment. "I'll be back Sunday," he said, "before your game." "You always come back," she said confidently, like it was a law of physics. He smiled. "Yeah, I do." She hugged him once hard, then pulled back. "Daddy." "Yeah. If the lady with the tight hair is mean to you," Lily said very seriously, "you should tell her that it's not okay." He laughed. Actually laughed the full kind from somewhere real. "I'll keep that in mind. Mrs. Patterson always says if someone doesn't respect your feelings, you should use your words clearly." "Mrs. Patterson is a very smart woman." "I know." Lily nodded. "So are you. So is the lady, probably. You'll figure it out." He kissed her forehead, picked up his bag, and walked out into the kind of weekend he hadn't touched in 3 years. He almost felt ready. Then his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number that resolved on second look into the assistant's line Victoria had given him for operational communication. "Car arrives at your building in 20 minutes. One additional item of note, my mother will be at the venue when we arrive Friday evening for the rehearsal dinner. She does not know your background. Please do not volunteer it." He read it twice. Thought of what Owen had said. "There is going to be a moment with Margaret Hale." He typed back, "Understood." He picked up his bag, walked to the elevator. The doors closed. And Daniel Garrett, former Navy intelligence contractor, current single father, and part-time private investigator, rode down to the lobby of his building and stepped into whatever this weekend was actually going to be. He'd been in rooms full of wolves before. He'd always walked out. But he had a feeling, quiet, low-grade, and absolutely reliable, the kind his body had developed through 3 tours, and never lost that this particular room was going to be different. Not more dangerous. Not less survivable. Just different. The kind of different that changes things after. The car was black clean, and waiting exactly where she said it would be. The driver held the door without being asked. Inside, Victoria was already seated studying documents on a tablet, not looking up when he got in. He settled into the seat. The door closed. She didn't say anything for half a block. Then, without looking up from the tablet, "Thank you for coming." He looked out the window. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We haven't walked in." She turned a page on the tablet. "No," she said quietly. "We haven't." The city moved past the windows. Clean morning light. The kind of day that had no idea what it was about to carry. They drove toward the Whitmore Grand in silence, and Daniel Garrett kept his eyes forward and his instincts wide open. Because somewhere inside that hotel, a man in a perfect suit was already making his last calculations. And he had no idea yet that the final variable had just arrived. The Whitmore Grand didn't look like a battlefield. That was the point. 12 floors of polished stone and imported marble, a lobby that smelled like fresh flowers, and old money staff who moved with the quiet efficiency of people trained never to make anyone feel watched, even when they absolutely were. Daniel had been in enough high-value environments to recognize the architecture of controlled impression. Every surface in this building was designed to tell you that nothing bad could happen here, which meant in his experience that when something bad did happen here, no one was ready for it. He walked in beside Victoria at 7:43 on a Friday evening, carrying nothing but a slim leather folder she'd had prepared for him, the kind that said, "Consultant," without screaming it, and a phone loaded with 4 applications that had no business being on a civilian device, but that Owen's contact had installed remotely that afternoon, without asking unnecessary questions. Victoria walked the way she always seemed to walk, like the floor had been laid specifically for her arrival. Back straight, pace-measured expression, calibrated to project authority without aggression. She was wearing a deep navy dress that she'd changed into somewhere between the car and the lobby. He hadn't asked how, and she carried herself like someone who had walked into 100 rooms that didn't want her and had won every single one. Daniel stayed half a step behind and to her right, close enough to be clearly associated, far enough to have independent sightlines. He scanned without appearing to scan old habit, the kind that lived in the body now rather than the mind, and within 40 seconds of entering the lobby, he had already cataloged 6 things, the location of every exit. He could see the positioning of the 2 men near the far corridor, who were dressed like guests, but standing like security. The single-camera blind spot created by the flower arrangement beside the elevator bank. The fact that the rehearsal dinner was being held in the Whitmore's second-floor private dining room rather than the main ballroom, which changed his acoustic assumptions entirely, the name badge on the event, coordinator moving toward them. Diane's senior staff, nervous energy, probably dealing with a last-minute change, and the man standing at the top of the staircase. Reed Calloway. In person, he was better than the photograph. That was the first thing Daniel registered, and he registered it the way he would have registered a threat assessment upgrade, not with alarm, but with a quiet recalibration of every assumption he'd made the night before. The photograph had captured the smile. It hadn't captured the way the man used his whole body as a social instrument, the way he turned toward the person he was speaking to, like they were the only person in the building, the way his hands moved when he talked open and easy and completely unthreatening, the laugh that came at exactly the right moment and landed exactly the right way. He was standing with 2 older men Daniel didn't recognize, yet both of them leaning slightly toward him. Not in deference, in comfort. In the specific body language of people who had decided without quite knowing why that they trusted this man completely. Reed Calloway was not dangerous the way a weapon was dangerous. He was dangerous the way carbon monoxide was dangerous. Invisible, odorless, and by the time you realized something was wrong, you'd already been breathing it for too long. Daniel kept moving, didn't look at Calloway for more than 1 second. Looking too long was as bad as not looking at all. Calloway is at the top of the stairs, he said quietly, without turning toward Victoria. I see him, she said, just as quietly, nothing in her voice. He sees us. He's been watching the entrance for the past 10 minutes based on where he was positioned when I checked the lobby camera feed on the drive over. She smiled at someone across the lobby, a warm, effortless social smile that had nothing to do with how she actually felt. He's been waiting to see who I brought. He knows you'd bring someone. He's been expecting a lawyer or a private security presence he could easily identify and work around. A pause. He's not going to be sure what you are. That uncertainty is the first thing we use. They reached the staircase. Reed Calloway turned from the 2 older men as they approached, and his face arranged itself into an expression of such genuine warmth that Daniel felt the specific chill he only felt around people who were extraordinarily good at being false. Victoria. He opened his arms slightly, not enough for a hug she hadn't invited, just enough to signal openness, goodwill, the performance of a man who held no grudges toward the woman who had been visibly skeptical of him for 2 years. You look incredible. Sophie's going to be so happy you're here. I wouldn't miss it, Victoria said. Her voice was perfectly warm, perfectly calibrated. She matched his performance note for note, without letting him know she was performing. Reed, this is Daniel Garrett. He's been working with our compliance team this quarter. I hope you don't mind. There were a few things that needed attention before Monday's board meeting, and Daniel was already going to be in the city. Reed turned to Daniel, and here it was. The moment Daniel had been thinking about since the night before. He'd done this specific thing dozens of times, walked into a room where someone dangerous was operating, and made himself into something that didn't register as a threat. The trick was never to perform too hard. Threat actors who were good at reading people got suspicious of performances. What you needed wasn't a disguise. You needed to be completely boringly, exactly what you said. You were a man who was here for one thing and had no particular interest in anything else. He shook Calloway's hand. Firm brief appropriately professional. Made eye contact for the standard duration. Mr. Calloway, congratulations. Please read. The hand was warm and dry. The grip was calibrated strong enough to establish confidence, not so strong as to signal anything competitive. And thank you. Tomorrow's going to be something special. He glanced back at Victoria with a smile that was saying, "We both know you've had doubts about me, and I'm not threatened by that. And isn't that admirable of me?" Don't let Victoria keep you buried in spreadsheets the whole weekend, Daniel. There's good food and better wine tonight. I'll do my best, Daniel said pleasantly. Calloway looked at him for exactly 1 beat longer than the conversation required. Not long, just 1 beat. Then he turned back to the 2 men behind him, and the moment passed, and Daniel moved with Victoria toward the dining room entrance. "He made you," Victoria said very quietly. "He flagged me," Daniel corrected. "He doesn't know what I am yet. He just knows I'm not what the cover says." How long before he figures it out? Depends on how careful he is tonight. If he's smart, and he is, he'll spend the evening testing edges. Asking questions that sound social. Watching how I respond to things I shouldn't respond to if I'm just a compliance consultant. He turned a page in the leather folder without looking at it. Let him. The more time he spends assessing me, the less time he spends on whatever he's actually supposed to be executing tonight. He has an associate here, Victoria said. Someone on staff. I haven't identified who yet. The event coordinator is clean. She's stressed about a centerpiece situation, not about anything with real stakes. He glanced sideways. The 2 men near the corridor when we came in, those are his, not yours. She didn't look toward the corridor. I only contracted 1 security presence for this weekend. Evans, he's already upstairs. So the other 2 are Calloway's or hired through him. Probably for physical insurance rather than any operational role tonight. He wouldn't want anything disruptive at the rehearsal dinner. Too visible. Too many people who'd remember. Then what is tonight? Observation, Daniel said. Same as me. He's watching. He's measuring. He's confirming that everything is still on track for tomorrow, and that nothing unexpected has entered the equation that requires an adjustment. He let a brief pause sit. Right now, I'm the unexpected thing. He needs to categorize me before he moves forward. So we let him watch. We let him watch, Daniel agreed. And while he's watching me, you tell me everything you know about the guest list and which of those people have any connection to the board vote on Monday. They stepped into the private dining room, and the noise of a family gathering, warm layered, complicated the specific sound of people who loved each other and drove each other absolutely insane, washed over them both. And then the room shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was exactly the kind of thing that only the right people noticed. Daniel noticed it because noticing things was what kept people alive. It started with a woman near the far side of the room, mid-60s, silver hair, worn elegantly, a deep green evening dress, who had been in conversation with 2 other women and had been holding a champagne glass in the relaxed way of someone at ease in the room. She turned when they entered. The way people do, the idle social scan of arrivals. She looked at Victoria first. Expected. Natural. Then her gaze moved to Daniel, and she stopped. Not physically. She didn't step back or drop the glass or make any of the visible dramatic gestures that the word stopped might imply. But Daniel had spent 12 years reading people in environments where a single micro-expression could indicate whether you were about to walk into an ambush, and what Margaret Hale's face did in the 3 seconds after she saw him was not something he could misread. Her eyes locked. Her jaw shifted almost imperceptible from relaxed to held. The champagne glass that had been loose in her hand became something she was gripping. The smile she'd been wearing didn't disappear, but it hollowed out like the person behind it had stepped back from the window and left the expression running on its own. She knew him. Not from this weekend. Not from anything connected to the Hale Corporation's current operations. From somewhere else. From something older. He kept walking. Kept his face completely neutral. Gave her nothing to work with except the image of a man who hadn't noticed the moment at all. Victoria, half a step ahead, hadn't seen it. He needed to think about that. The rehearsal dinner moved. The way these things moved, with toasts that ran 3 minutes longer than they should, with a seating arrangement that generated at least 2 quiet arguments among family members, who had extremely specific feelings about proximity to each other, with food that was genuinely excellent, and almost nobody actually tasting because they were too busy managing relationships across the table. Daniel ate. He drank water. He listened. That was the part people always underestimated. They assumed intelligence work in social environments was about action, about moving pieces, making approaches, executing plans. And sometimes it was. But mostly in rooms like this one, the most important thing a person could do was be quiet and let other people fill the silence. Reed Calloway, across the table from where Daniel had been strategically seated by Victoria, close enough to the Hale family center without being family, a position that read as professional proximity, held court the way Daniel had expected. He told a story about meeting Sophie at a gallery opening that had everyone smiling. He deferred to Sophie's opinions in the conversation in the specific way that made women feel seen and made the men around them relax their defenses. He included Margaret with practiced, effortless warmth, turning to her at the right moments, laughing at her small jokes, touching Sophie's hand when he referenced something emotional, with the unconscious ease of a man who had choreographed every gesture and made the choreography invisible. Sophie herself, and Daniel watched her carefully, was luminous. There was no better word. She had her sister's coloring and none of her sister's armor, and she watched Reed with the specific expression of a woman who had stopped wondering whether she deserved to be loved and had decided simply that she was. It was an expression that made Daniel feel the weight of what the weekend actually meant. Not the corporation, not the board vote, not the legal architecture Calloway was building. This woman, this specific happiness. What happened to it at the end of all this? Victoria had said she will never forgive me. He understood it now in a way he hadn't from an apartment kitchen on a Thursday morning. Midway through the main course he felt it. The shift in attention, the small directional adjustment. Margaret Hale was looking at him again. This time, he let her. He kept his attention on the conversation in front of him. A distant Hale cousin was explaining something about a vineyard investment in exhausting detail, and kept his peripheral vision soft and wide, and let Margaret Hale look at him for as long as she needed to. She made her move 11 minutes later. He'd gotten up to find the restroom genuinely because tactical positioning didn't override basic biology, and was returning through the corridor when a voice came from the small sitting area near the staircase. Composed, deliberately pitched not to carry. "Mr. Garrett." He turned. Margaret Hale stood with her champagne glass still half full and an expression that he could not quite categorize. Not hostile, not frightened. Something more complex than either. Something that looked, if he had to find the closest word, like a person standing in front of a door they had locked a long time ago and were now being asked to open. "Mrs. Hale," he said. "How long have you been working with my daughter?" "A short time," he said. "This is primarily a this weekend arrangement. Victoria arranged it." "Yes." Margaret looked at him with the kind of quiet, sustained attention that required considerable practice to maintain without it becoming confrontational. "Are you going to tell me who you are, or are we going to stand here and perform the version where neither of us acknowledges what's actually happening?" He held her gaze. "I think that depends on what you believe is actually happening. I believe," she said carefully, "that my daughter did not hire a compliance consultant. I believe she hired someone with a specific kind of background for a specific kind of purpose." A pause. "And I believe I've seen you before. Not in person, but your name, Mr. Garrett, was in a report. A federal compliance audit report, 7 years ago." He waited. "A company called Meridian Logistic Partners," she said. "They were contracted by a federal agency through a third-party intermediary. The audit exposed what turned out to be significant financial fraud funds being siphoned through falsified contracts over a period of nearly 4 years. Several hundred employees had their pension contributions redirected through shell accounts." She looked at him steadily. "The lead investigator on that audit was never publicly named. But his operational codename was in the internal summary that my husband's attorney shared with us because Hale Corporation had been approached about a potential acquisition of Meridian 2 months before the investigation concluded. The codename was Garrett. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, someone laughed at something the Vineyard cousin probably still going. The acquisition didn't proceed, Daniel said. No, Margaret agreed. Because the report came out, and because whoever Garrett was, he was thorough enough that there was nothing left to hide behind. She took a slow breath. Those employees got their pensions back. Most of them. Enough. Something crossed her face, not quite gratitude, but the specific expression of someone who had carried something for a long time and was deciding whether to put it down. My husband knew 2 of them, personally. One of them had worked for Meridian for 19 years. Daniel didn't say anything. Victoria doesn't know this, Margaret said. She was 28 when it happened. She wasn't involved in the acquisition review. A pause. My husband died 3 years ago. He was the one who knew, who kept the file. She looked down at her champagne glass, then back up. When you walked into this room tonight, Mr. Garrett, I thought I was imagining it. And then I thought, no, Victoria. This is exactly the kind of thing Victoria would do. Mrs. Hale, he said, I need you to understand something. Yes. If what I'm here to do this weekend is going to work, he said quietly, it requires that Reed Calloway has no reason to believe I'm anything other than what the introduction said. Any change in your behavior toward me, anything that suggests you know something, gives him information he can use. She absorbed this. You think he's watching me. I think he watches everything. It's how he operates. He kept his voice even. I know this is complicated. I know tonight is supposed to be a celebration. And I know that what I'm here to do involves your daughter, and that no outcome of this weekend is going to feel entirely clean. He paused. But Sophie is the reason I'm here. Not the corporation. Not the board vote. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Long enough that Daniel heard the sound of the dinner resuming inside glasses, voices Sophie's laugh floating clearly over everything else. Then Margaret said quietly, He's using her. Yes. She has no idea. No. Another silence. He watched her process it, not with hysteria, not with denial, but with the controlled, precise grief of a woman who had built things and lost things and knew exactly what both felt like. What do you need from me? She said. Right now, nothing. Go back inside. Laugh at the toasts. Let tonight be what Sophie thinks it is. He held her gaze. I'll handle the rest. She straightened, took a slow breath. When she looked at him again, her face had resettled into the composed, elegant expression she'd been wearing all evening, but there was something different underneath it now, something that recognized him. You're a single father, she said. It wasn't a question. He paused. How did you know that? Because you said Sophie is the reason you're here, not the corporation. A small, precise, almost smile. Men who've been hired to protect corporations talk about corporations. Men who have children talk about people. She looked at him for one more moment. Take care of my daughter, Mr. Garrett. She walked back toward the dining room. Steady, composed, not a single step out of place. Daniel stood in the corridor for 3 seconds. Then he looked back down the hallway toward the far end, where he had noticed 20 minutes ago that the angle of the wall mirror gave him an indirect sightline to the dining room entrance, and confirmed what he'd half suspected while standing in the corridor talking to Margaret. Reed Calloway had not been in his seat for the last 4 minutes. Daniel moved. Not fast was visible. He moved with the purposeful, unhurried stride of a man going exactly where he meant to go, and he took the longer route back to the dining room. The one that curved behind the service corridor and through the window at the corridor's far end. He confirmed that Calloway was now back at the table already mid-sentence, Sophie's hand in his, looking for all the world like a man who had simply stepped out for 60 seconds and returned. 60 seconds. In 60 seconds, a man like Calloway could have made a phone call, sent an encrypted message, or identified a specific conversation he'd needed to observe from an angle that wasn't his own seat. Daniel sat back down at his place, picked up his fork, caught Victoria's eyes across the table. She raised one eyebrow, the smallest possible question. He gave her nothing back. Not here. Not with Calloway 4 seats down and watching the mirror himself. Later. He'd tell her later. The toasts began at 9:15. Sophie's maid of honor, a college friend named Becca, who had the warm, earnest energy of someone who genuinely meant every word she said, went first, and she was funny and loving and completely real, and Daniel noticed that even he felt the pull of it. The specific pull of watching someone be genuinely happy about something. Then the best man went. Then an uncle who told a story about Sophie at age 7 that made 3 people cry. Then Reed Calloway stood up, and Daniel set down his glass, kept his face pleasantly attentive, and listened with everything he had. Because this was what he'd actually been waiting for. Not the content of the speech. The content would be perfect. He already knew that. It would be warm and specific and full of details that proved how well he knew Sophie, how much he paid attention, how deeply he felt things. What Daniel was listening for was the underneath, the rhythm, the tells, the moments when the performance slipped by half a frame and the calculation underneath surfaced for just long enough to be real. Reed spoke for 4 minutes. He talked about the gallery opening where they'd met. He talked about the weekend 6 months in, when he'd actually known that Sophie was it for him. He talked about her laugh, her stubbornness, her ability to see beauty in things that other people walked past without noticing. He talked about the family she'd brought him into, glanced at Margaret warm and grateful, and about the life they were going to build together. He was extraordinary. That was the honest truth. Daniel had heard a lot of speeches, and he had watched a lot of people perform sincerity, and Reed Calloway was among the best he'd ever seen. 3 times during the speech, he paused in a way that felt like emotion. 2 of those pauses were real. The body doesn't fully obey the mind under the pressure of a room full of eyes, and Calloway's genuine feeling was there somewhere complicated and tangled up in everything else. He was not purely cold. That would have been simpler. The 3rd pause was a beat he'd practiced. Daniel clocked the difference the way he would have clocked the difference between a sound that was wind and a sound that was a person trying to sound like wind. Afterward, when the glasses had been raised and the noise had risen back to its natural level, Calloway sat down and put his arm around Sophie, and she leaned into him with total trust, and Daniel looked away. He looked at Victoria instead. She was watching Calloway. Her expression said nothing, but her left hand resting on the table beside her water glass had closed into a fist. He reached over casually briefly and set 2 fingers against the back of her hand. Not a grip, not a gesture with any particular weight, just I see it too. I'm here. She glanced at him. He looked back at the room. After a moment, her hand opened. By 11, the dinner was winding down. People were drifting toward the lobby bar for the extension that always happened at these things, the part where the formal structure fell away and the real conversations, the ones people had been saving all evening, finally started. Reed Calloway shook hands and kissed cheeks and moved through the room with the smooth efficiency of a man maximizing every minute of favorable impression. He stopped near Daniel, once deliberate positioned as casual, and asked about his work. Compliance is interesting, Calloway said, holding his whiskey with a relaxed 2-finger grip. Especially in a family-run structure. There's always so much history tangled up in the process. There is, Daniel agreed pleasantly. But history is usually where the most important information lives in my experience. Calloway smiled. Exactly. You have to know where to look. And when to stop looking, Daniel said. Knowing when you have enough is just as important as knowing where to find it. A beat. Calloway's smile didn't change. What firm did you say you were with? I'm independent, Daniel said. Project basis. Victoria and I have a good working relationship. Another beat. Then, what branch were you in? Daniel held his glass steady. Sorry. Military. Calloway gestured loosely at him, the practiced gesture of a man making a casual observation. The posture, the way you scan a room. I had a college roommate who did 4 years Army. You get that look. Daniel let a small, self-deprecating smile come through just enough. Navy. Long time ago. He let the subject close with his body language, a slight shoulder turn, a glance back toward Victoria, the signal of a man who found the topic both true and boring. You have a good eye. People are my thing, Calloway said simply. Mine too, Daniel said. He walked back to Victoria's side, and he did not look back, and he said nothing. And he thought, Monday is not his real deadline. Something moves before Monday. Something moves tomorrow at the wedding, before the ceremony is done. He didn't know what yet. But the way Calloway had asked that final question, not angry, not alarmed, just quietly recalibrating the way a man does when he realizes a variable has entered the equation, and he needs to decide whether to accelerate or adjust, told him everything. He found Victoria near the lobby entrance at 11:40, her coat on her, expression giving nothing away to anyone around them. When they were outside, she said, What did he say to you? He asked what branch I served in. She went still. He made you. He flagged me. Daniel said again the same correction, but this time it meant something different than it had 4 hours ago. And he's not going to stop, which means tomorrow he moves earlier than we expected. He looked at her directly. We need everything tonight. Whatever you were planning to do Sunday morning, we do it tonight. She didn't hesitate. I'll call my analyst. And your mother knows who I am, Daniel said. Victoria's expression shifted for the first time all evening into something unguarded. What? The Meridian audit. 7 years ago. She had access to the internal summary. He watched her process it. She's not a problem. She's steady and she won't show him anything, but you should know. He paused. She asked me to take care of Sophie. Victoria looked at him for a long moment, in the particular way of someone recalibrating a picture they thought they'd already finished drawing. She said that, Victoria said quietly, word for word. A pause. Then Victoria Hale, CEO of Hale Corporation. The woman who walked into every room like she'd already decided how it ended, looked away for exactly 3 seconds. When she looked back, everything was composed again. The armor was back on. All right, she said. Let's get to work. They walked back through the lobby. The night ahead was still several hours long, and the wedding was still 18 hours away. And Reed Calloway was upstairs in a suite that Daniel was going to need access to before morning. And the next 24 hours were going to require everything he had. But Margaret Hale had asked him to take care of her daughter. And Daniel Garrett had never once in 12 years of impossibly complicated situations failed to do what he said he was going to do. He didn't plan to start now. He didn't sleep. That wasn't unusual. In the field, sleep had always been a negotiation, something you took in pieces when the situation allowed and surrendered without complaint, when it didn't. Daniel had learned years ago that the body could run a long time on discipline and the particular kind of alertness that only existed when the stakes were real. What sleep he did take, he took between 1 and 3 in the morning, sitting upright in the chair by the window of the room Victoria had arranged for him, a room on the same floor as Calloway's suite, which had not been an accident, with his phone on the armrest and Owen's contacts monitoring application running quietly in the background. The application was logging network traffic, specifically the traffic moving through the Whitmore Grand's guest Wi-Fi and the secondary secured network that the hotel used for administrative and event coordination functions. Owen's contact, a man Daniel knew only as Reyes, and had worked with twice before, under federal contract, had built him an access bridge that afternoon, and by 2:15 in the morning, it was returning data. Not damning data. Not yet. Calloway was careful in exactly the ways Daniel expected a careful man to be careful. The communications he was sending weren't through any of the obvious channels. No email. No standard messaging application. The traffic pattern Reyes's tool was identifying was encrypted peer-to-peer, the kind of application that left almost no metadata, designed specifically for people who understood that the content of a communication mattered far less legally than the fact of it being traceable at all. What Daniel did get was timing and volume. Between 1 and 4 in the morning, Calloway's device generated 11 distinct encrypted exchanges. 11. At a rehearsal dinner the night before his wedding, a man in love with the woman he was marrying generated 11 encrypted communications in 3 hours. Daniel wrote the timestamps down in his notebook, actual paper, actual pen, the way he'd always done it because screens could be taken and paper could be swallowed if it came to it, which it never did anymore, but the habit stayed and looked at the pattern. The exchanges clustered in 2 groups. 4 between 1 and 1:40, then a gap, then 7 more between 3 and 4. The gap matched the window when hotel security did their floor walk a timing that meant Calloway had either researched the security schedule or had someone on the inside who'd told him. Victoria had said, "He has an associate here, someone on staff." By 3:15 he had a candidate, one of the Whitmore's event staff, a man named Colin Reeves, according to the staff directory. Diane, the event coordinator, had shared with Victoria's assistant for logistics purposes, had badged in and out of the service corridor on Calloway's floor twice in the past 6 hours. Once at 11:40 p.m., once at 2:50 a.m., both times outside of any documented event requirement. The rehearsal dinner had ended at 11. There was no setup scheduled on that floor before 6 a.m. Daniel photographed the badge log on his phone and sent it to Reyes with 3 words. Cross-reference this. Reyes came back in 14 minutes. Colin Reeves. Employed Whitmore Grand 11 months. Prior employment. Private Event Logistics. Delaware. Registered agent for one of those companies, shares an attorney with 2 dissolved Calloway business partnerships. Philip Crane, the Denver lawyer. There it was. Calloway hadn't just walked into this wedding. He'd staffed it. Daniel sat with that for a moment, feeling the shape of the operation. The way you felt the shape of a room in the dark by moving slowly and trusting what your hands told you. This wasn't improvised. This wasn't opportunistic. Calloway had started building this the moment the engagement was announced, possibly before. He had a contact inside the venue. He had encrypted communication infrastructure in place. He had a legal framework already constructed through Sophie's signature on that proxy agreement. The only thing he hadn't built in was Daniel Garrett, which meant the next 12 hours were going to require Calloway to improvise around a variable he hadn't accounted for. Improvisation was where people made mistakes. Daniel closed his notebook, checked his phone, 1 a.m. missed call from Lily's number, which meant Mrs. Hensley had let her try, which meant she missed him, which he filed away in the specific compartment where he kept things he wasn't allowed to feel until later, and went back to work. By 5:30, he had a clear picture of what Calloway's Monday mechanism looked like. The proxy agreement Sophie had signed 8 months ago was only part of it. The second piece was a document that needed to be filed with Hale Corporation's legal administration before Monday's board meeting, a share reclassification form that, once processed, would convert Sophie's voting shares into a class of non-voting preferred stock, with Reed Calloway listed as the beneficial interest holder during the conversion period. The language was buried in 12 pages of what had been presented to Sophie as an estate planning simplification. The filing window opened at 9 a.m. Monday. The document had already been prepared and was sitting in a law firm's queue, ready to transmit. Calloway needed one thing for it to execute cleanly: Sophie to remain unaware until after the ceremony, after the honeymoon departure, and past the Monday morning filing window. 72 hours. That was all he needed. He'd been 51 hours into it when Daniel walked into the lobby. At 6 a.m., Daniel sent Victoria everything. A summary document through the encrypted channel Reyes had set up for them, tight and factual, the way he would have written an operational brief, the shell company confirmation, the staff plant, the communication timeline, the filing mechanism, the law firm, the document. Her response came back in 4 minutes. The document. "Can we stop the filing?" he typed. "Only if Sophie revokes the proxy before 9 a.m. Monday. Everything else is derivative. Stop the source, the mechanism dies." A pause. Then, "She has to know." "Yes." Another pause. Longer. Today. It has to be today. Before the ceremony. Daniel looked at his notebook, at the timeline, at the 11 encrypted exchanges between 1 and 4 in the morning, and the man on the other side of them who was right now probably sleeping peacefully because he believed he had won. Today he typed back. But not before we have the audio. We need him on record, or she won't believe the documents alone. Victoria Howe. Calloway's going to make a move this morning, before the ceremony. He needs to confirm his insurance. He's going to contact someone in person, not encrypted, because there's one piece of this he can't do digitally. I need to find it, and I need to be close enough when it happens. A longer pause than any of the others. Then Colin Reeves. Yes, Daniel typed. Reeves is the in-person link. Whatever Calloway can't trust to encryption, he runs through Reeves. And this morning, Calloway is going to finalize something through Reeves. Something about the document execution or the post-ceremony sequence. Victoria. You're going to follow Reeves. I'm going to be where Reeves goes. He thought for a moment, then added, I need your access credentials for the hotel's administrative system. The service corridor cameras. The credentials came through in 2 minutes. He was in position by 7 a.m. The wedding was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Ceremony in the Whitmore's Garden Terrace reception in the main ballroom. That gave him 7 hours, and the first 3 of those were the ones that mattered, because the morning before a wedding was the last window of relative privacy before the entire event machine locked into place and everyone's movements became visible and documented. Colin Reeves moved at 7:22. Daniel tracked him through the service corridor camera feed on his phone, moving parallel through the public corridors at a pace that matched without crowding. Reeves was carrying an equipment bag standard for event staff, completely legitimate looking, and he moved with the particular efficiency of someone who was not going to make this take any longer than it had to. He went to the business services room on the 2nd floor. The one the hotel used for administrative printing and secure document handling for corporate events. The one that required a staff badge to enter. Daniel didn't have a staff badge. He had the administrative credentials Victoria had just given him, which allowed him to unlock the access log for that room, and as it turned out, after 45 seconds of work in the elevator, to add a temporary credential to the room's secondary entry system. The kind of thing the hotel's IT contractor would recognize as a routine administrative override. The kind of thing Colin Reeves would have no reason to expect. He was in the room 2 minutes after Reeves. The equipment bag was open on the table. Inside it, under a layer of cable management tools, a sealed envelope, and a tablet displaying a document queue. Daniel took 3 photographs with his phone before he heard the door. He was behind the equipment rack when Reeves came back from wherever he'd stepped out. He stayed completely still, controlled his breathing the way he'd been trained to control it in spaces much smaller and considerably more dangerous than a hotel business services room. Reeves moved to the table, picked up the envelope, put it in his jacket and left. Daniel let him go. He had the photographs. He had the document queue ID, which Reyes could use to pull the actual filing content. He didn't need the envelope. The envelope was downstream evidence. What he needed was upstream. He needed Calloway saying it himself. He got out, went back to his room, and called Victoria. The document queue is active, he said when she picked up. Reyes is pulling the content now, but we have a problem with the audio component. What kind of problem? Calloway isn't going to expose himself verbally to Reeves. Reeves is the logistics layer, he handles the physical execution. Calloway talks to one person about what this actually means, and that's not Reeves. He sat down. It's his attorney, Philip Crane. Crane isn't at the wedding. No, but he's on call, and Calloway is going to make one phone call today before the ceremony somewhere private to confirm the execution sequence with Crane. That's the call we need. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Can you intercept it? I can if I know when and where he makes it. And I know one thing about Calloway, he's not going to make that call from his suite. He's too careful. He'll go somewhere the hotel doesn't have cameras. There are 3 camera blind spots in this building, Victoria said immediately. He heard her pulling something up. The east stairwell between floors 3 and 4, the loading area behind the kitchen, and the garden terrace, Daniel said, where the ceremony is. A pause. The setup crew is there from 8 to noon, she said. Calloway has reason to be there. He's the groom, no one questions the groom walking through the ceremony space. What time does setup finish? Keys clicking. Crew breaks at 9:30 for 45 minutes. Daniel checked his watch. 7:51. I need to be on that terrace before 9:30, he said. I can get you there. Sophie wants a final walkthrough of the space with me at 9:15 family only before the setup crew comes back. If you're already in the terrace before the crew breaks, I'll be there. Daniel. A pause. Something in her voice shifted, not much but enough. If this doesn't work, if we get to 2 o'clock without what we need, we won't, he said. But if we do, Victoria. He kept his voice steady. I don't build plans that don't work. I build plans that work and contingency plans for when they don't, and then I build contingencies for those. We're not going to 2 o'clock without what we need. A long pause. Then quietly. My sister is getting her hair done right now. She called me at 7 this morning and she was so happy. I could hear it. He didn't say anything. He let that sit for a moment the way it deserved to sit. I know, he said finally. I know. Whatever happens today, Victoria said, she can't hate herself for it. She can't walk out of this feeling like a fool. Whatever we show her, it has to be clear that she wasn't stupid, that he was just that good. He is that good, Daniel said. That's exactly what we tell her, because it's true. He heard her exhale. Okay. Get dressed. Go be with your sister. Be completely present with her this morning. Don't give him anything to notice. Right. And Victoria. He paused. Don't let her see your face when you're thinking about this. You compartmentalize well, but she knows you. She'll see the edges. A short silence. You've known me for less than 48 hours. I know, he said. Go. She hung up. He went to the terrace at 8:55, moving through the garden-level access corridor, with the administrative override still active on his credentials. The setup crew was still working Floral's chairs, the archway that someone had spent considerable time making look effortless. He moved along the wall, unhurried, looking for all the world like a man with a legitimate reason to be there, and found his position behind the stone partition that separated the main ceremony space from the garden's secondary entrance. The crew broke at 9:27. He heard them leaving. The voices, the equipment, the door. Then quiet. The particular quiet of an outdoor space that was holding its breath before something important. At 9:41, he heard footsteps on the stone path. Calloway came in from the main terrace entrance. He was alone. He was wearing a casual jacket over a dress shirt, relaxed in the way of a man who had no reason to be tense, moving with the easy confidence of someone who believed the morning was going according to plan. He walked to the center of the terrace, the same spot where in 4 hours he would stand and make promises to a woman who believed every word, and he took out his phone. He dialed. Daniel was 12 feet away behind the partition with the audio capture application Reyes had installed running on his own phone. He held still and listened. Crane. Calloway's voice was different in private. Not colder exactly, more compressed, like a recording played back at its original speed after being slowed down for a room that couldn't handle the full tempo. Everything is on schedule. The queue executes Monday morning. Reeves confirmed the document transfer. A pause, Crane speaking on the other end. No, the compliance woman is a non-issue. I've been watching her consultant, and I think he's closer to personal security than corporate counsel, but he's one person, and he doesn't know what he doesn't know. Another pause. The proxy covers everything through the conversion period. Once the filing processes, Sophie's shares are reclassified and the board vote is moot, regardless of how Victoria performs. She can keep the CEO title. I don't need the seat, I need the mechanism. Calloway moved slightly. Daniel tracked the shift in his voice without moving and said, Monday afternoon we transfer primary beneficial interest to the Cayman account. The trust administration takes 30 days to catch up at minimum. By the time anyone with standing to challenge it files anything, we're past the statutory window. A shorter pause. Crane, I've been building this for 2 years. Every piece is in place. I'm getting married in 4 hours. Let me finish the job." He hung up. 12 feet away behind a stone partition in a garden that smelled like white roses and expensive optimism. Daniel stopped the recording and made sure it had saved. It had. He waited until Calloway's footsteps faded back toward the main entrance. Then he stayed still for another 40 seconds, because 40 seconds was the amount of time it took to be sure. Then, he typed a single message to Victoria. "We have it." Her response took 11 seconds. "Where?" "Room 412. 30 minutes. He moved out of the terrace and back through the garden-level corridor and up the east stairwell, and he thought about what came next. Not with anxiety. Anxiety was noise, and he'd learned to turn that particular noise down to nearly nothing a long time ago. He thought about it the way he thought about everything operational, clearly, sequentially, with full acknowledgement of what he could control and what he couldn't. He could control the evidence. He had the audio, the documents, the shell company, trail the staff plant confirmation, and the filing mechanism. The package was complete. It was the kind of thing that didn't require belief. It required only comprehension. What he couldn't control was Sophie. The moment they showed her everything inside that woman's world was going to fracture. Not just her understanding of Reed, her understanding of the past 2 years. Every memory she had of him, every kindness she had attributed to love, every moment she had felt seen and chosen and safe. All of it was going to require reinterpretation in the space of a few minutes in a hotel room on her wedding day, with her dress hanging on the back of the door, and her hair done, and her face made up, and her whole family downstairs believing she was getting married in 4 hours. That was not a small thing. That was the weight of the whole weekend, and it didn't belong to the corporation or the board vote or any of the legal mechanisms Daniel had spent the night unraveling. It belonged to a woman who had stopped wondering whether she deserved to be loved. Victoria was in the room when he arrived. Margaret was there too, standing near the window, composed, already knowing from something in Victoria's face that the morning had moved. Victoria looked at Daniel when he walked in, and he nodded once, and she closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them, and she was back. "Play it," she said. He played the recording. The room was absolutely silent while Calloway's voice filled it. Compressed, efficient, articulating with complete clarity exactly what the past 2 years had been and what the next 48 hours were supposed to accomplish. Margaret Hale, by the window, did not move. Her face did not change. She had the stillness of a woman who had been preparing herself for confirmation of something she already knew, and who had decided that when it arrived, she was not going to give it the satisfaction of breaking her open. When it finished, Victoria said, "How certain is the filing mechanism?" "Certain enough that if we don't stop it by 9 a.m. Monday, it executes automatically. No further action required from Calloway." "Can we block it legally independent of Sophie's revocation?" "Your legal team can file an injunction, but without Sophie's cooperation, it takes longer than the statutory window Calloway mentioned." "He's right about that." He looked at her directly. "It has to be Sophie, and it has to be today." Victoria looked at her mother. Margaret said, "I'll bring her here." Victoria shook her head immediately. "Not yet. Not before she's here with us. If she walks in not knowing in her dress and we—" "She's already in her dress," Margaret said quietly. "She came to show me 20 minutes ago." A pause. "She looks beautiful." The silence that followed that sentence was the specific kind that exists when everyone in a room understands simultaneously what is about to be taken from someone who deserves better. Victoria turned to the window. She stood there for a moment, her back to both of them, and Daniel watched her hold it, all of it, the decision and the love and the damage that was coming regardless of what they did, because there was no path through this morning that ended without Sophie's heart on the floor. The only question was whether it happened now with the truth in her hands, or later with nothing left to hold. Victoria turned back around. "Bring her," she said. Margaret left without another word. Daniel looked at Victoria. She was standing in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides, and the expression of someone who had made the hardest call of the weekend. Harder than any of the operational decisions. Harder than the legal strategy. Harder than standing in a room with Reed Calloway and performing warmth she didn't feel. "She's going to be angry with you," he said, not to be cruel, because it was true and she needed to hear it from someone who wasn't going to soften it. At first, before she gets to the part where she understands, the anger is going to land on you first. Victoria absorbed this. "I know." And then it won't. She looked at him. "It takes time," he said, "but it won't stay." He paused. "She's going to need you on the other side of it. That's what she's going to need more than anything." Victoria held his gaze for a moment, and he watched something settle in her. Not peace. Not anything as resolved as peace, but something that recognized itself as necessary, as the only thing left to be. "Stay in the room," she said. "You sure?" She's going to have questions about the documents, about the legal mechanism. She paused. And she's going to need to see someone who doesn't have a stake in how she feels about it. Someone outside the family. She looked at him with the directness that had been in her face since the first morning in his kitchen. The same directness, but quieter now, stripped of its corporate armor. "Stay in the room, Daniel." He nodded. The door opened 3 minutes later, and Sophie Hale walked in radiant and entirely unprepared in the white dress she'd chosen 11 months ago, on a morning she had believed with everything she had was the beginning of the life she'd always wanted. She looked at her sister's face, and she knew. Not the specifics, not the evidence, not the shell companies, or the proxy agreement, or the Cayman account, or Philip Crane on a garden terrace with a phone call that had recorded its own damnation. But she knew the way people who love each other always know when something is wrong. The way you know, before you know the way the body understands what the mind is still catching up to. She looked at Victoria, then at Margaret, then at Daniel, the stranger her sister had brought, the man who'd been introduced as a compliance consultant standing in a hotel room on her wedding day, with a look on his face that said, "I'm sorry. And it's real. And you're going to be okay. I need you to believe that last part." Sophie Hale looked back at her sister. "Tell me," she said. Her voice was steady, steadier than it had any right to be. Victoria stepped toward her, and she told her. Sophie didn't cry right away. That was the thing that stayed with Daniel afterward, the specific terrible composure of a woman absorbing something that should have knocked her flat, and choosing instead to stay upright through sheer force of a will she probably didn't even know she had until that moment. She sat in the chair by the window, still in her wedding dress, and she listened. She listened the way people listen when they understand that the information coming at them is going to permanently alter something, and that the only thing they can do about that is receive it clearly, so they understand exactly what shape the damage is going to take. Victoria talked for 11 minutes. She laid it out the way Daniel had laid it out for her, sequentially, factually, without editorializing, without the kind of emotional framing that would have made it easier to reject. The proxy agreement. What Sophie had been told it was versus what it actually was. The shell companies. The filing mechanism. The Monday morning execution sequence. The phone call. When Victoria reached the phone call, she looked at Daniel. He took out his phone and played it. Calloway's voice filled the room again. Compressed and certain, and utterly without the warmth that Sophie had believed in for 2 years. The warmth wasn't even pretending anymore. In private, on a phone call, he believed no one would ever hear Reed Calloway spoke about Sophie Hale, the way a contractor speaks about a job site as a location, a resource, a mechanism through which an outcome would be achieved. "I'm getting married in 4 hours. Let me finish the job." Sophie's eyes didn't move from the middle distance while the recording played. Her hands were folded in her lap, completely still. When it ended, the room held its silence like something fragile. Then Sophie said, "Play it again." Daniel played it again. This time she closed her eyes. Not from pain, or not only from pain, from the specific effort of a person making absolutely sure they understood every word exactly as it was, so that when this moment was over, There was no room left for doubt to find its way back in. Because doubt was the thing that let people forgive what shouldn't be forgiven. And Sophie Hale, sitting in her wedding dress on the morning her wedding was supposed to begin, was making a decision that she was going to have to live with, and she was making it with both eyes open. The recording finished. She was quiet for 15 seconds. Then she said to no one in particular, "He told me the estate planning form was to protect my future." "Yes," Victoria said softly. "He sat across the table from me." Sophie's voice was completely level. "He held my hand while I signed it. He said it was the most important thing he could do for me, making sure that if anything ever happened to him, I would be protected." She stopped. "I remember thinking how thoughtful it was. I remember thinking, this is a man who thinks about things, who plans, who takes care of people." A pause. "I remember thinking I was lucky." Margaret near the door made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound, the kind that comes out of a mother who is physically restraining herself from crossing the room. "Mom," Sophie said quietly. "I'm okay." "I know," Margaret said. She was clearly lying, and they all knew it, and no one said so. Sophie looked at the documents on the coffee table. The printouts Daniel had organized the night before, the financial trail, the shell company cross-references the Philip Crane connection. She didn't touch them. She looked at them the way you look at evidence of something you're still processing, something you're not quite ready to fully hold in your hands. Then she looked at Daniel. He'd been standing near the wall, deliberately peripheral, giving the three women in the room the space this moment required. When Sophie looked at him, he met her gaze directly. Not with apology, not with the softened expression people offered to wounded things. With the same steadiness he'd been operating from all weekend. She deserved steadiness right now, more than she deserved softness. "You found all of this," she said. "Yes." "In 2 days." "Yes." She absorbed that for a moment. "Why, you're not family. You're not—" She looked at Victoria. "You hired him." "I did." Sophie looked back at Daniel. "Why did you say yes?" He thought about Lily's coloring book, about the horse with the purple rainbow, about the way she'd said you'll figure it out with the confidence of someone who had never had reason to doubt him. Because someone needed to, he said. It wasn't a sophisticated answer. It wasn't strategic or tactical or particularly articulate. It was just the truth, and he'd found over the years that the truth delivered plainly was usually the only thing that worked when everything else had been built from lies. Sophie held his gaze for another moment. Then she nodded once small, the nod of someone who had accepted an answer and filed it away and was moving forward. She stood up. She reached down and picked up her left hand with her right hand, not dramatically, not with any visible performance of the gesture, and she slid the ring off her finger. A cushion-cut diamond, the kind that caught light from every direction. She set it on the coffee table beside the documents, and it sat there between them, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. "Freeze my trust," she said to Victoria, "before he touches anything. Whatever the legal process is, whatever we need to file, whoever we need to call, I want it done before noon." Victoria said, "I already have our legal team on standby." "Then call them." Sophie's voice was still level, still controlled. "And I want the proxy revocation documented with a witness, not just our lawyers, an independent witness." She looked at Daniel. "You." "I'm not a licensed attorney," he said. "I'm not asking for legal advice. I'm asking for a witness. Someone who has no connection to this family and no stake in what happens Monday." Her jaw was set. "Someone who can't be argued away later." He nodded. "All right." She looked at her mother. "I need 5 minutes alone before this becomes what it's about to become." Margaret crossed the room and held her daughter for exactly 5 minutes and 4 seconds by Daniel's count, and he looked at the wall and let them have it. When Margaret stepped back, Sophie looked at herself just briefly. One glance down at the dress, and something crossed her face that Daniel had no word for. It wasn't grief exactly, or not only grief. It was the expression of a person saying goodbye to a version of this day that had existed in their imagination for nearly a year and choosing to let go of it completely so they could deal with what was actually in front of them. It took maybe 3 seconds. Then it was gone, and Sophie Hale was fully present in the room, and the decision had been made. "Victoria," she said, "let's go." The next 90 minutes were the most controlled, precise, and quietly devastating thing Daniel had ever been adjacent to in a career that had included 2 hostage negotiations and a corporate espionage case in Singapore that had lasted 4 months. Victoria called the legal team. The senior partner, a woman named Aldridge, who apparently kept weekend hours for exactly this category of emergency, had a draft revocation document ready within 20 minutes, because Victoria had told her on Friday morning to prepare for the possibility, and Aldridge, unlike most people in the world, did exactly what Victoria Hale asked her to do without asking why. The document was sent electronically. Sophie read every word of it. Every word. She asked 2 questions, specific technical about the effective date and the scope of revocation, and got answers that satisfied her, and then she signed it with a pen from Daniel's inside jacket pocket, because it was the only pen in the room, and she asked without hesitation, and he gave it to her without comment. He signed as witness. Aldridge countersigned remotely. The document was filed and time-stamped at 11:17 a.m. Then Victoria called the second attorney, a separate firm. No conflict of interest. Someone who specialized in corporate trust administration to begin the formal process of ring-fencing Sophie's shares against any claim filed through the proxy structure. That call took longer. 34 minutes. Sophie sat through it without leaving the room, listening to every exchange, asking 2 more questions at the end. Through all of it, Daniel monitored Calloway's device activity through Reyes's tool running passively on his phone. The encrypted exchanges had stopped. Either Calloway was in the quiet zone of a man who believed everything was still on track and had nothing left to communicate, or he was operating through a channel that Reyes couldn't see. At 11:58 he found out which one. A text from Reyes. Subject device active. Searched hotel employee directory. Staff name Colin Reeves. Search conducted from subject device 4 minutes ago. Calloway had noticed Reeves was off pattern. He was looking for him, which meant Calloway was beginning to sense that something had shifted. Daniel sent Victoria a message under the table while Aldridge was still talking. Calloway is aware something is wrong. He doesn't know what yet. How we handle the next hour determines whether this stays clean. She read it, typed back without looking up from the table. Define clean. He signs away the proxy claim voluntarily. No public confrontation. No scene at the wedding venue. Sophie doesn't become a news story. A pause. What do we need for that? A room. Him. Us. The evidence. And the understanding that his alternative is considerably worse. Victoria excused herself from the call for 30 seconds. Where? The bridal study. It's private. It's documented as a family space for today, and it's far enough from the main event areas that a conversation there doesn't carry. He won't come willingly. He'll come, Daniel said. If the invitation sounds like an opportunity, he thinks he's managing an unexpected variable. Give him the chance to manage it directly. That's the kind of offer a man like Calloway can't refuse, the chance to be in the room where he can read the situation and adapt. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. You want to give him a room full of the evidence that ends him. I want to give him a room where he walks in believing he has options and leaves understanding he has one. She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Then, how do we get him there without tipping him? You invite him. You're his future sister-in-law. You tell him there's been a family situation that's caused a delay in the ceremony timeline, and you need 15 minutes with him to manage the guest communications. He'll read it as the beginning of a negotiation he thinks he can win. Daniel paused. He won't even consider that it's already over. Sophie had been listening. She stood up, and her voice when she spoke was the flattest, most contained thing Daniel had heard from her all morning. I want to be there. Sophie, Victoria started. I want to be in that room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. He looked at me every day for 2 years. He held my hand. He told me he loved me. She stopped. Not from emotion overwhelming her, from the effort of making the emotion work for her rather than against her. I want to look at him while he understands what he did. I'm not asking permission. The three of them looked at each other. Then Daniel said, "Stand near the door. Don't engage until it's time. Let it build. When you're ready, you'll know when say what you need to say. But not before." She met his eyes. "Okay." Victoria sent the message to Calloway at 12:19. "There's been a small family situation, nothing to worry about, but I need 15 minutes with you before we communicate with guests about a potential timeline adjustment. Bridal study, 2nd floor. Can you come now?" The response came back in 4 minutes. "Of course. Be right there." Daniel watched the message come in and felt the specific quiet that settled over him when an operation moved from the preparation phase into the execution phase. It was a kind of focus that he couldn't fully explain to people who hadn't experienced it. Not tension, not adrenaline, just a complete narrowing of everything irrelevant until only the necessary remained. His heart rate had probably dropped. It usually did. He positioned himself near the document table on the left side of the room. Victoria took the center. Sophie stood near the door, not blocking it, just present, visible. Her hands folded in front of her in the white dress she hadn't changed out of, because there hadn't been time, and because Daniel suspected she had decided on some level that she was going to let Reed Calloway see exactly what he'd done. At 12:31, the door opened. Reed Calloway stepped into the bridal study with the expression of a man who was ready to manage a problem, which was a different expression than a man who was ready to manage his wedding. And the difference, small-trained, completely invisible to people who weren't looking for it, told Daniel everything he needed to know about where Calloway's head was. He saw Daniel first. Something happened in Calloway's face. Extremely quick. Extremely controlled. But it was there, the micro-expression of a man who had just walked into a room and discovered that the variable he'd been trying to categorize for 20 hours was no longer peripheral. It was central. It was standing by a table covered in documents. Calloway recovered in under a second. His face rearranged itself into the concerned, attentive expression of a groom responding to a family situation on his wedding day. He looked at Victoria. "What's going on? Is everyone all right?" "Close the door, Reed," Victoria said. He closed it, turned back, took 2 steps into the room, and stopped when he saw the documents on the table. He didn't show anything in his face, but he stopped, and the stopping was enough. "I think we should talk," Victoria said. "Of course." Still composed, still performing. "What's this about?" "Meridian Logistic Partners," Daniel said. Calloway looked at him. "I don't know what that is." "Philip Crane does," Daniel said. "He also knows what a Delaware holding company formed 6 weeks after a man's first public appearance with his fiancée is typically used for." He picked up the top document from the table, the Shell Company cross-reference, and held it up. He probably also knows that the filing queue he has active for Monday morning has already been flagged by Hale Corporation's legal team. A beat. Calloway's eyes moved from Daniel to the documents to Victoria. The assessment was happening at full speed now, reading the room, calculating, looking for the leverage point, the loose thread, the exit. "I'm not sure what you think you've found, but this feels like a significant misunderstanding, and I think if we all take a breath." "Reed." Sophie's voice came from the door. He turned, and Daniel watched something happen to Reed Calloway that 2 years of practiced performance couldn't fully contain. Not guilt, or not only guilt. Something more primitive than that. The expression of a man who had told a very complicated lie to a very specific person, and was now standing in front of that person on the day the lie was supposed to pay off, and finding that the lie had run out of road. It only lasted a second, maybe less. But it was real, and it was there, and Sophie saw it, and from the way her jaw tightened, Daniel knew she'd needed to see it. Not the evidence alone. The evidence was paper. It was recordings. It was legal architecture. She'd needed to see what happened to his face when he saw her, and understood that she knew. "I heard the recording," she said. She didn't move from the door. Her voice was as level as it had been all morning. "The phone call you made from the garden terrace this morning. I heard what you said to your attorney." A pause. "I want you to tell me it isn't true. Not because I'll believe you. Because I want to know if you'll at least have the honesty to admit it when there's nothing left to gain from lying." Calloway looked at her for a long moment, and then, and this was the thing that Daniel would remember, the single moment in the entire weekend that clarified everything else, Reed Calloway dropped the performance. Not completely. Not in a way that revealed remorse or shame or any of the things that might have made him more human. He dropped it the way a man drops a tool he no longer needs. It just went away. The warmth, the attentiveness, the practiced openness. All of it folded back into whatever it had come from, and what was left was exactly what Daniel had identified the moment he saw the photograph on Thursday night. A man who was very good at wanting things, and very skilled at getting them, and completely without interest in the cost to anyone else. "You would never have been happy with what you already had," Calloway said to Sophie. "Not with cruelty. That was the thing, not with cruelty at all. With the flat, business-like tone of someone stating a fact. You were never going to be the one running things. Not in your family, not in your own life. I gave you 2 years of feeling like the most important person in any room." He paused. Most people would consider that a fair exchange. The room was completely silent. Sophie looked at him for 5 full seconds. Then she said, "Get out of my family's hotel." He turned to Victoria. "The proxy document has been revoked," Victoria said. "Filed and time-stamped this morning. The legal team is injuncting the Monday filing as of this call." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "The 2 men you placed near the lobby corridors have been identified and asked to leave by hotel security. Colin Reeves is no longer employed by this venue as of 30 minutes ago. Philip Crane will be receiving a document preservation notice from our attorneys within the hour." Calloway looked at Daniel. "You did all this in 48 hours. "Less," Daniel said. A long pause. Then Calloway did the only calculation left to him. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked at the 3 people in the room. He was a man who had spent his career understanding when a position was untenable, and the particular skill that had made him good at what he did, the ability to read a room and adapt without allowing emotion to interfere with the reading, was working against him now, because what the room told him was unambiguous. There was no thread left to pull. There was no loose edge. The woman he'd built 2 years toward had revoked the document. The filing was blocked. The evidence was documented, witnessed, and in the hands of people who knew what to do with it. "What do you want?" he said. "You're going to sign a full withdrawal of every legal claim, actual or constructive, against any Hale family trust or corporate interest," Victoria said. "You're going to dissolve the Delaware holding entity within 30 days under independent supervision. You're going to make a statement to your attorney confirming his non-participation in any future action against any Hale interest." She paused. "In exchange, we don't forward the audio recording to the federal authorities, who would be very interested in the Cayman account transfer sequence you described this morning." Calloway was quiet. "You have until 2 p.m., Victoria said, "which is when the ceremony was scheduled to begin. If you're not done by then, the recording goes to people who know what to do with it." Another pause. Shorter this time. "I'll need my attorney present," he said. "Philip Crane can join by video." Victoria looked at him evenly. "You have the room until 2. He took out his phone, made the call. While it connected, he looked at Sophie one more time, not with the warmth he'd performed for 2 years, and not with the flatness he'd shown when the performance dropped. With something in between that Daniel couldn't quite categorize, something that might have been on some level genuine. "You deserved better than this," Calloway said to her. That part was true. Sophie looked at him. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't try to leave me something to hold on to. I don't want it." He nodded once. Then he turned away and started talking to Crane. Daniel moved to stand beside Victoria at the window, while Calloway negotiated his own surrender on the other side of the room. She was watching him with her arms folded, her expression completely controlled and completely exhausted beneath the control. "How are you doing?" Daniel said quietly. She glanced at him sideways. It was the first time all weekend she'd looked at him like that, not assessing, not directing, not deploying him toward a specific task. Just looking. "I've been better." "Yeah. I've also been worse." She looked back at Calloway. "Thank you. For the garden terrace. For last night." A pause. "For staying in the room." "Sophie asked me to." "Sophie asked you to," Victoria agreed. "And you stayed." She was quiet for a moment. "Not everyone does what they say they're going to do." He didn't answer that. It didn't need an answer. Calloway finished with Crane at 1:47 p.m. The withdrawal document Aldridge had drafted because Victoria had told Aldridge to draft it at 7 a.m. because Victoria prepared for every variable was signed at 1:53. Witnessed by Daniel, countersigned by Aldridge remotely. Filed and timestamped at 1:59 p.m. At 2:03 p.m. Reed Calloway left the bridal study, walked down the second-floor corridor, took the elevator to the lobby, and left the Whitmore Grand without speaking to anyone. The room was quiet again. Sophie sat down in the chair by the window, the same chair she'd sat in when Victoria had told her 2 hours ago what the morning actually was. She sat down, and she put her face in her hands, and she finally, after everything, let herself cry. Not loudly, not with any of the dramatic release the moment might have called for in a movie or a story told for the sake of the story. Just quietly, steadily, with the controlled sorrow of a woman releasing something she'd been holding upright for 2 hours, because releasing it before now would have made her less able to do what needed to be done. Margaret sat beside her immediately and said nothing, which was exactly right. Victoria stood on the other side and put her hand on her sister's back, and also said nothing, which was also exactly right. Daniel went to the window, looked out at the city, gave them what the moment required, which was the simple privacy of being allowed to feel something enormous without an audience. After a while, he heard Sophie laugh. Not a full laugh. Not something recovered and whole. Just a short, wet, exhausted sound that had some humor somewhere at the bottom of it. "My hair," she said. "I paid $400 for this updo." Victoria made a sound that was something between a laugh and a sob. "It still looks good." "I'm in a wedding dress in a hotel room at 2 in the afternoon," Sophie said, "with no wedding." "We can order room service," Margaret said. "Whatever you want." Sophie laughed again. More this time. Less fragile. Daniel turned from the window. Sophie was looking at him with red eyes, and the expression that had something new in it. Not quite okay. Not anywhere near okay yet, but past the acute stage of the thing, and into the longer survivable stage. "My sister's going to be insufferable about this," Sophie said to him. "She's never going to let me forget that she was right about him." Daniel looked at Victoria. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. Then said with visible effort, "I wasn't going to say that." "You were absolutely going to say that," Sophie said. "Eventually," Victoria admitted. "In a year, maybe 18 months. Sophie shook her head. But the smile underneath it was real, and it was hers. And Reed Calloway had nothing to do with it. Daniel looked at his watch. 2:17 p.m. He had until Sunday 11 a.m. Lily's game. He had time. But the weekend, he understood, was not finished. The crisis had collapsed cleanly the way Victoria had wanted it, without a public scene, without the kind of damage that would follow Sophie into the next chapter of her life. The legal mechanism was stopped. The withdrawal was signed. The evidence was filed. What remained was the particular work that came after the operational part ended the work of being present in the aftermath, which was different work entirely and required different things than what the past 48 hours had asked of him. He was still in the room, still here. And Victoria Hale, standing on the other side of her sister, glanced at him once over the top of Sophie's head, with an expression he hadn't seen from her all weekend. Not the CEO expression, not the operator expression, not the performance of control over a situation that required control. Just a look. clean and direct, and carrying something in it that was going to take him a while to know what to do with. He held it for a moment. Then Sophie said something that made Margaret laugh, and the moment passed, and the afternoon settled into something that was still difficult, but was at last honest. Outside the window, 2 floors below the white roses in the garden terrace, were still standing in perfect arrangements around an empty arch waiting for a ceremony that had quietly ceased to exist. Nobody went to take them down. Not yet. The rest of Saturday passed. The way the aftermath of hard things always passes slowly at first. Then in a rush, then in the particular quiet that comes when the adrenaline has finally burned itself out, and what's left is just the truth of the situation. Unmediated sitting in the room with you, whether you're ready for it or not. Room service arrived at 3:15. Sophie had changed out of the wedding dress by then into clothes Margaret had retrieved from her suite, practical and plain, the specific comfort of fabric that had no occasion attached to it. The dress was hanging on the back of the bathroom door, and no one mentioned it, and the not mentioning of it was its own kind of kindness. They ate. Sophie drank 2 glasses of wine and ate most of a club sandwich and said almost nothing for 40 minutes, and the women who loved her sat close and said almost nothing too. And Daniel stayed at the far end of the table and worked through a plate of food he barely tasted while he ran a final check through Reyes's monitoring tool to confirm that Calloway's device had gone offline at the Whitmore's network perimeter, which it had at 2:22 p.m. 13 minutes after he'd walked out the lobby. Gone, clean, the way Victoria had wanted it. At 4 o'clock, Sophie looked up from her wine glass and said, "I need to call Becca." Becca, the maid of honor, the college friend who had given the warm, completely genuine toast the night before. Daniel thought about what that conversation was going to sound like, what Sophie was going to have to explain, and how many times she was going to have to explain it over the coming weeks to people who had been invited to a wedding that no longer existed. "Do you want privacy?" Victoria asked. "No." Sophie shook her head. "I want you in the room, in case I—" She stopped. "I just want you in the room." Daniel stood up quietly and took his plate to the side table. Sophie glanced at him. "You don't have to go." "I have some things to close out," he said. "Take your time." He meant it both ways, and she seemed to understand that, because she nodded in the way of someone accepting something that was being offered with more care than the words themselves carried. He spent the next 2 hours in his own room working through the documentation package with Reyes. Everything needed to be organized, not for the legal team who had their own documentation streams, but for the record that Daniel kept for every engagement. The kind of record that lived in a physical file in a locked drawer in his apartment, because he'd learned early that digital archives had a way of being accessed by people who hadn't been invited to access them, and that the only storage he fully trusted was paper and proximity. He wrote up the operational summary by hand, 12 pages. The timeline, the evidence chain, the communication intercepts the Reeves identification, the garden terrace, recording the withdrawal execution. Every step documented, every decision noted, every outcome recorded. At the bottom of the last page he wrote, "Sophie Hale proxy revocation filed and confirmed 11:17 a.m. Saturday. Calloway withdrawal signed 1:53 p.m. Saturday. Board filing blocked. Corporate interest preserved. Primary objective complete." He looked at that last line for a moment. Then he wrote underneath it smaller, "Secondary objective." She walked out of that room still herself. Complete. He closed the folder. His phone buzzed. "Mrs. Hensley Lilly wants to say goodnight. Is that okay?" He called immediately. Lily answered on the second ring with the breathless energy of a child who had been waiting for exactly this and was trying very hard not to seem like she'd been waiting for it. "Daddy?" "Hey, Bug." "Mrs. Hensley let me have 2 scoops of ice cream." "Did she?" "Strawberry and mint chip, not together. In separate bowls." "That's very civilized." A pause. The small particular pause of a 6-year-old deciding whether to ask the thing she actually wanted to ask. "Are you coming home tomorrow?" "Before your game," he said. 11 o'clock. I'll be on the sideline." "Promise." He thought about the operational summary in the folder on his desk, about Reed Calloway in a lobby elevator going somewhere that wasn't here anymore, about Sophie Hale eating a club sandwich in a hotel room in a city that had no idea what had just happened inside it. "Promise," he said. "I'll be there." Another pause. "Daddy?" "Yeah." "Did you use your words clearly?" He almost smiled. Mrs. Patterson's advice relayed through Lily with complete seriousness. "I used my words clearly. Good. Satisfied. Certain. The confidence of someone who had given good counsel and was pleased to hear it had been applied. I love you." "I love you too, Bug. Get some sleep." After he hung up, the room was quiet in the specific way of hotel rooms, sealed and neutral, carrying no history of whoever had been in them before. He sat with the quiet for a moment. Thought about Lily's soccer game tomorrow. About the way she ran all out, no strategy, pure commitment to the direction she'd chosen. He'd never told her to pace herself. He figured she'd learn that on her own when she was ready, and until then, why teach a 6-year-old to hold back? He was still sitting with that thought when the knock came. 3 knocks, even unhurried. Not the knock of someone with an emergency. The knock of someone who had decided to come and was following through on the decision. He opened the door. Victoria Hale was standing in the corridor in a gray sweater and dark trousers. Not what she'd been wearing all day. Not the armor of the blazer and the controlled presentation, but clothes that looked like things she actually wore when no one required anything of her. Her hair was down. Not styled, just down. It made her look less like a CEO and more like a person, and the transition was significant enough that it took him a half-second to recalibrate. "Sophie's asleep," she said. "My mother's with her." "Good." She looked at him for a moment. "Can I come in?" He stepped back. She came in and looked at the room the way she looked at every room, briefly, systematically, and then she looked at the folder on the desk and the handwritten pages inside it visible, because he hadn't closed it fully. "Is that the report?" she said. "My copy. Your legal team has everything relevant." She nodded. Didn't ask to read it. He appreciated that. She sat in the chair by the desk, not stiffly, not with the posture she maintained in professional spaces, but with the particular exhaustion of someone who had been running at full capacity for 72 hours and was finally allowing themselves to stop. She put her elbows on her knees and looked at the floor for a moment. "How's Sophie?" he asked. "Sleeping," Victoria said. Before that, she was more okay than she should be, I think. And also less okay than she was pretending. She paused. "That's Sophie. She's been doing that her whole life. Being more okay than the situation calls for until she's somewhere she can stop doing it." A pause. "She'll fall apart properly in about a week, when the shock has worn off and the reality of what the next few months look like starts to settle in." Another pause. "And then she'll put herself back together. She always does. She's tougher than the situation gave her credit for," Daniel said. "She's the toughest person in our family," Victoria said quietly. "She just doesn't know it because she's never needed to look like it." She looked up from the floor. "I was the one who needed to look like it. So that's what I became. The one who looks like it." He didn't say anything to that. He just let it be what it was. The kind of thing someone said when they were tired enough to say the true version instead of the managed version. "The board vote is Monday morning," she said. "I know. I'll need to be back in the building by 7 a.m. "That's fine. I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not trying to make this about the board vote. Another stop." He watched her navigate something she was clearly less practiced at than crisis management, which was saying the personal thing out loud to another person. "I wanted to say thank you before it becomes Monday, and I'm a CEO again, and you're a contractor, and the weekend has a formal ending that I didn't—" She stopped again. He waited. "I didn't want the formal ending to be the only one," she said. He looked at her. The woman who had slid a blank check across a table 2 days ago and told him to name his price. Who had arranged childcare for his daughter without asking, and then acknowledged it without being asked. who had stood in a hotel corridor outside a rehearsal dinner and held herself together with both hands, while her sister's world was 2 hours from being dismantled. Who had looked at him over Sophie's head with an expression that wasn't the CEO expression, or the operator expression, or any of the expressions she maintained for the rooms that required something from her. Just a look, clean and tired and real. "The board vote," he said. "You're not worried about it?" She shook her head slowly. "No. Calloway's mechanism was the threat. That's gone." She looked at him. "I was worried about it before you walked in. Once you found the filing mechanism, no. I've been running this company for 6 years. Without someone else's hand in the machinery, there's nothing to worry about." A pause. "That's not arrogance. That's just I know what I can do." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You know, Owen told me, not about your record specifically, about how you are when someone isn't actively trying to take the floor out from under you." He paused. "He also told me you run on 3 hours of sleep and institutional determination." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, too tired for a full one, but the architecture of one. "Owen talks too much. Owen talks exactly enough. He knows what information is useful." He paused. "He told me you were worth the drive. He was right." She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her expression was doing the thing it had done when she was standing over Sophie's head on the other side of the room, carrying something she hadn't decided what to do with yet. "Monday," she said, "after the board meeting." "Yeah, I'd like to—" She stopped. This was harder than the operational conversation. It was clearly harder, and she was clearly aware that it was harder, and the awareness of it was making her more careful than she was about things that were merely complicated. "I'd like to see you again, under circumstances that don't involve a crisis." He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't know what he thought, because he wanted to say it correctly. "I have a daughter," he said. "I know. That's not a footnote. That's the main text." "I know that too." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking for a footnote. I'm asking if there's room for a conversation, one that doesn't have an operational objective." She paused. "I'm aware that I'm bad at conversations that don't have operational objectives. I'm aware that's a thing I need to be honest about." "You arranged childcare without asking," he said. "And I acknowledge that was wrong. You did." He looked at her. "That matters more than the arranging did." She absorbed that. "I'm not—" She stopped. "I've been running things for so long that I sometimes forget to ask if the people in the room have their own direction." A pause. "You have your own direction." "I do." "Lily," she said. "Lily," he confirmed. She nodded slowly, not with disappointment, with the expression of someone taking in information and updating their understanding. "What does she like?" The question surprised him enough that he answered it honestly without thinking about it first. "Purple. Anything purple. Soccer. Chapter books about animals. Strawberry ice cream in a separate bowl from everything else." He paused. "She's 6. She's very clear about what she likes." Something in Victoria's face changed. Quietly. The way light changes when a cloud moves, not dramatic, just different. "She sounds wonderful." "She is," he said. "She's the best person I know. I say that without any bias whatsoever." Victoria's almost smile came back slightly fuller this time. "Of course not." He looked at her for a moment. "Ask me directly," he said. "Whatever you're actually asking. You know how to do that. I've watched you do it all weekend." She held his gaze. Then, without the stops this time, "Have dinner with me, next week. Somewhere that isn't a hotel or an operational environment or anything associated with this weekend. Just dinner." A pause. "If you come, don't come as my contractor." He recognized it, the same words from the outline he'd built from Owen's briefing. The possibility he'd filed under after, because there was too much operational ground to cover before they got there. He'd filed it honestly, without certainty, the way you filed things that depended on how the weekend went on, Whether the person on the other side of the crisis turned out to be who you thought they were when you were only looking at a photograph and a financial document and a blank check on a kitchen counter. She had turned out to be exactly who he'd suspected, which was simultaneously more complicated and more straightforward than the file suggested. A woman who forgot to ask, who remembered when you told her, who stood in a hotel room and made the hardest call of the weekend, not because it served the corporation, but because she loved her sister enough to absorb whatever damage the call would cost her. Who sat in a chair in a hotel room at 7 p.m. on a Saturday and said, "I didn't want the formal ending to be the only one," in the specific careful voice of someone who was not accustomed to needing things from other people and was deciding to try it anyway. "Friday," he said. "I'll need to find someone for Lily. I can arrange—" She stopped, caught herself, looked at him. "I won't arrange anything. You'll handle that." "I'll handle that," he confirmed. "Friday," she said. "Friday," he agreed. She stood up, looked at him for a moment in the specific way she'd looked at him in the corridor outside the rehearsal dinner, in the car on the way to the Whitmore, in the bridal study, when Sophie was on the phone with Becca, the look that wasn't the armor, but the person underneath it, which was a different thing and considerably harder to carry. "Get some sleep," she said. "You have a soccer game tomorrow." "I do." She walked to the door, put her hand on the frame, turned back once, not dramatically, just the natural movement of someone who has one more thing and wants to say it. "For what it's worth," she said. "Lily was right about you." He looked at her. "You've never met Lily?" "No. But she told you that you'd figure it out. And you did." She looked at him evenly. "She has good judgment." He almost laughed. "Yeah, she does. I'll tell her you said so." Victoria held his gaze for one more moment. Then she walked out and the door closed behind her with the same soft, precise click it had made in his kitchen on Thursday morning. But different now, carrying something different in its sound, the way the same note sounds different depending on what's come before it. He stood in the quiet room for a moment. Then he went to the window and looked out at the city, which was doing what cities always did, moving indifferent, full of its own business, completely unaware of the specific weight of what had happened inside one hotel over the past 48 hours. That was the thing about cities. They didn't make room for individual gravity. They just kept going, and you had to carry your own weight and keep moving with them. He was okay with that. He'd always been okay with that. He went to bed at 8:30 and slept without interruption until 5 a.m., which was the longest unbroken sleep he'd had in 3 years, and he didn't examine that too carefully because some things were better accepted than analyzed. He was dressed and checked out by 6:30. He left a handwritten note for the hotel's head of security about Colin Reeves's employment history and the Philip Crane connection, not because it was his job, but because it was the right thing, and the hotel's staff deserved to know what had been operating inside their building. He slid it under the security office door and walked to the elevator. The lobby was quiet at this hour. Clean morning light through the tall windows. A single staff member at the front desk, who looked up and then back down at his computer. The flower arrangements from the rehearsal dinner had been moved to the lobby, white roses in tall vases, still fresh, still perfect, carrying no knowledge of what they'd been part of. He walked past them and out the front door. His car was in the structure 2 blocks east. He walked with his bag over one shoulder and the leather folder under his arm and the morning air on his face. And he thought about Lily's soccer game in 4.5 hours, and about the operational summary in the folder, and about Victoria's handwriting. He'd seen it on one of the documents she'd marked up Friday night, which was surprisingly small and precise for a woman who took up so much room in every other way. He thought about Friday. About dinner that wasn't operational. He thought about the things you built after the hard part ended. The things that had to be built differently than everything else, slower with more care with actual asking, instead of assuming because they had to hold more than the hard part ever did. He was still thinking about it when his phone buzzed. A text from a number he recognized now. Not the assistance line. Her direct number, which she'd given him for operational communication, and which he understood from the timing of this message was being used for something else. Sophie ate a full breakfast this morning. She's asking about the best attorneys for trust restructuring. She also asked me to thank you. She said she'll probably thank you herself at some point, but not yet, because right now it would make her cry, and she's had enough of that for the weekend." He read it, then read it again. Then he typed back, "Tell her she's welcome, and tell her the crying's not done. She should let it happen when it comes. It moves faster that way." The response took 2 minutes. "She says she knows. She also says you should come to dinner sometime." Her words, not mine. I had nothing to do with that. He smiled at his phone. Actually smiled the full kind, the same kind Lily's voice had pulled out of him on Thursday morning. He typed, "Tell her I'll take her up on that." After Friday. He put his phone in his pocket and kept walking. At 10:53 a.m., he pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Community Park where Lily's team, the Purple Dragons, who wore purple jerseys that Lily had campaigned for through 3 parent meetings and sheer attrition, was doing their pre-game warm-up on the near field. He could see her from the parking lot. She was doing her version of stretching, which mostly involved spinning in a slow circle with her arms out, which was not technically a warm-up, but which she did before every game, and which he had never once suggested she stop doing. He got out of the car. She saw him before he reached the gate. He watched it happen the moment her eyes found him. The full-body recognition, the immediate abandonment of the spinning, and the sprint across the grass in his direction that had absolutely no self-consciousness in it. The pure, uncomplicated joy of a child running towards something she loves. He crouched down and caught her. She hit him at full speed, which at 6 years old and 48 pounds was still enough to knock a person back half a step, and she wrapped both arms around his neck and held on with the specific grip of someone who had been waiting and was now done waiting and wanted him to know it. "You came," she said into his shoulder. "I said I would." "I know." She pulled back to look at him. Her eyes were searching his face with the particular attention of a child checking for damage. "Are you okay?" "I'm good, Bug." "Did the lady with the tight hair?" She stopped, reconsidered. "Was it hard?" He looked at his daughter, 6 years old, purple jersey grass already on her shoes, from 30 seconds of standing near the field, asking him if the weekend was hard with the full seriousness of someone who understood that hard things happened and wanted to know where he landed on the other side of them. "Yeah," he said honestly. "It was hard." She nodded. Like she had expected that. Like hard didn't frighten her as long as she knew the truth of it. "But you did it." "We did it," he said. "All of us together." She considered this. Was the lady nice? He thought about Victoria in the chair. About, I didn't want the formal ending to be the only one. About, I won't arrange anything. You'll handle that. About the small, precise handwriting and the 3 a.m. operational texts, and the way she'd looked at him when he'd said, "I don't build plans that don't work." And she'd believed him, not because he'd said it with confidence, but because he'd already demonstrated it was true. "She's getting there," he said. Lily accepted this with the equanimity of someone who understood that getting there was a direction, not a destination, and that people who were moving in the right direction deserved the benefit of the doubt. "Okay," she said. "Watch my game now." "I'm watching," he said. She ran back onto the field. He stood at the gate and watched his daughter run all out. No held-back pure commitment to the direction she'd chosen, and thought about the weekend. About Sophie Hale sitting in her wedding dress, making the hardest decision of her life, with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. About Margaret Hale in a corridor saying, "Take care of my daughter," to a man she'd identified from a 7-year-old federal audit report, trusting without being able to explain the trust. About Victoria standing in every room this weekend, like she'd already decided how it ended, and the specific significant thing it had meant when she'd finally let someone else decide with her. About what you built after the hard part. About asking instead of assuming. About the Friday that was still 6 days away, and the dinner that had no operational objective except the only one that mattered, which was finding out who a person actually was when the crisis wasn't there to define them. He'd been in rooms full of wolves before. He'd always walked out. This time he'd walked out with something he hadn't gone in carrying. He wasn't entirely sure what to call it yet. But it was there, and it was real. And it was the kind of thing that didn't require a definition to be worth keeping. The referee blew the starting whistle. Lily got the ball within the first 40 seconds. Pure aggression. No apology. Exactly the way she played everything and took off toward the goal with the absolute certainty of someone who had never once in her 6 years considered the possibility that she wouldn't make it. She scored. She turned and found him in the crowd, immediately through the noise, through the other parents, through the whole cheerful Saturday morning chaos of it, and she found his face and grinned the way she always grinned. All of it. Every single tooth. He put both hands up. She turned back to the field and kept running. And Daniel Garrett, former Navy intelligence contractor, single father, the man who had spent a weekend inside someone else's war and won it cleanly, stood on a soccer sideline in the clear late morning light and understood with the same certainty he'd built his entire career on, the certainty that came not from optimism, but from having survived enough hard things to know what solid ground felt like under your feet, that what came next was going to be better than what came before. Not easier. Not without complication. Not without the particular weight of two people who were both accustomed to carrying things alone, figuring out how to carry something together. But better. He was sure of it.